Rail 200 is so real. Yep, we're back for more. So, today is the bicentennial of the Stockton and Darlington Railways' grand opening in 1825. It's honestly quite surprising at how much it had changed ever since the first railway had opened, thanks to locomotion number 1 operating across that route. And seeing how next year is the 250th anniversary of the United States' independence from Great Britain, it is surprising on how much things have changed ever since 1776. But I think I'm getting a bit off topic here, so I'll continue on talking about whatever I'm talking about before that. So anyways, this is the 14th entry to this series. Yeah, you get the idea. And yeah, that's basically it. This is just a video that I made for the 200th anniversary of the Stockton and Darlington and the 80th anniversary of the railway series. No surprises there. So yeah, let's just get this thing over with and we'll start off this thing, I guess. Number 1. The broad-gauged Cronk-and-Hardwicke Railway has operated steam locomotives for a very long time. However, in the 1980s, they have ordered a fleet of locomotives on EMD to operate between Hardwicke and Ballastine, in which they would become their 072 class, a fleet of diesel locomotives that was based on the 071 fleets from Ireland. After operating in a service for many years, the 072 classes were given a top priority of delivering materials that was needed bound for Ballastine, where a new nuclear power plant had been constructed around the 2020s, with the Little Western and Hardwicke branch lines being used as top priority for the standard gauge routes bound for Ballastine. At Hardwicke, the standard gauge lines would meet up with the broad gauge lines, and so a third rail was implemented between Hardwicke and Ballastine, creating a dual-gauged railway of some sorts on the island of Sodor. Although it wasn't technically the first ever dual-gauge railway to ever operate around the island, this brand new dual-gauge railway would operate towards the power plant at Ballastine, in which was surprisingly opened just recently around 2025, with connections via the standard and broad-gauge lines, thanks to an austerity engine that had been purchased and a broad-gauged industrial engine used for the power plant operations. The operations around the nuclear power plant would consist of nuclear flask operations done by direct rail services, which would travel across the Little Western and Hardwicke branch lines to get to the power plant at Ballastine via the dual-gauged railway line of the Cronk-and-Hardwicke. Many engines on Sodor would condone the operations of pulling these nuclear flask trains from a Sellafield plant across the mainland towards the nuclear power plants at Ballastine, where shunting can be commenced on the nuclear flask wagons, and will shunt them to a crane which then will transport them over to the nuclear power plant. The engines on Sodor on the standard gauge lines, as well as the broad gauge lines, would operate the services across the Ballastine plants, where materials and even general goods bound for Ballastine would be dropped off. The intermodal container services bound for the Ballastine plants would also be served by the broad gauge lines from their port at Hardwicke, just near to the beach station, which is located on the standard gauge portion of the lines, which also has its own transfer yards to the broad gauge container trains. The broad gauge lines of the Cronk-and-Hardwicke, as well as the standard gauge lines, would continue to transport these nuclear materials and general goods bound for the Ballastine plants via the dual gauged alignment, which is still in use as of today. Number 2. It is quite rare seeing an oil burner operate across the United Kingdom, but with talks of an engine being converted to burn oil in preservation, likely being done before, it is worth noting that the experimentation of oil-burning engines can come down to the trace and origins in North America. This didn't stop the railways of Britain from experimenting with oil burners, such as the Great Eastern and the Great Western Railway experimenting with oil burners, as well as engines that were produced domestically and exported to other countries where the oil-fired engines can be seen operating in action, with even some being planned or even already been converted to burn oil in the preservation era. In mid to late 2022, the the North Western Railway wanted to build a refinery plant to experiment on oil-burning engines due to a recent conflict that had occurred since early February. This was soon turned into the Tidmouth Oil Refinery Center, which is located north of the city and was opened in early 2023, where it would connect to the Northwestern Railway's main yards and sheds, where the refinery plant could pump out oil to the rail to Sodor, such as Tidmouth and Bickerstown. The engines that were selected for this trial was an ex-Glasgow and South Western Railway 403 class, otherwise known as the Other Red engine, an ex-Great Central Railway 8K, and a Great Eastern Railway D16 named Molly Thatcher. The three engines would be trialed along the main line, as the D16 would be used on passenger services, the 8K for goods services, and the 403 classes on mixed traffic duties, with the dynamometer cars being added to each of their consists. After about several weeks on trial, the three engines would come out with positive results on oil-burning engines operating along the island of Sodor, and it is expected by the early 2030s that all of the steam locomotives on the island would be converted to burn on oil, thanks to the success of these trials. Number 3. The WD 100 Austerities was a fleet of 060 shunting engines that were built by the Hunsrück Engine Company between 1943 and 1964, with 485 of these members being built for industrial use as well as exported use across Europe as well as the British Isles. The Austerities were glassed into service all the way up towards 1984, where the last of them had been withdrawn and many members of the austerity fleets have been preserved across Great Britain as well as in Europe. Around 1948, a colliery located somewhere within the mainland had recently ordered a fleet of engines from the Hunsrück Engine Company for operations across the colliery, and one of these engines would arrive alongside the other fleet of engines that were built by Hunsrück as they were placed into service around that colliery until their withdrawal sometime during 1979. Around the early 1980s, most of the austerities that had worked at the colliery was soon sent for scrap. However, the engine that was sold was sent to the Netherlands as it had its own adventure, as it was painted in the Longmore Military Services blue livery and was sent to Amsterdam to be on display at a rail yard just near the museum. A few years later, in the early 1990s, he was sent to a heritage railway just located within the Midlands, where it would soon become a LNER J94, in which it was numbered after the engine that was scrapped in 1967, and would remain on that heritage railway even into the 21st century, but would remain in operation with that said heritage railway ever since. However, that would all change within the 2020s, where rumors began to be spread that the engine may be sold off to its new owners, and this was confirmed by the Heritage Railway, as the engine would appear after its major overhaul in a Northwestern Railway styled black, where it will be sent to the island of Sodor to the old Cronken-Hardwick broad gauge railway, in which it was converted to run on dual gauge as far as Craigweir, where the entire line would run up towards Ballast Line, with steam engines running on standard gauge as well as diesel engines conjointly operating on the dual gauged lines from Hardwick bound for Craigweir and bound for Ballast Line to a nuclear power plant, which was recently opened just this year, and the engine would be placed into service around that same time along the now dual-gauged Cronken-Hardwick Joint Railway, where the engine would operate across the power plant as well as the portion between Ballast Line and Craigweir, and it's stated that the steam locomotive is still in operation to this day as a joint ownership between the Heritage Railway and the Northwestern Railway. Number 4. The Caledonian Twins of Sodor were based on the Caledonian Railway's A12 classes, and more specifically, the 652 classes that the twins are based on. These engines were built sometime during the early 20th century, as they were placed into service by the Caledonian Railways on goods traffic. They would soon later transfer ownerships between the LMS and even into British Railways, until the last of them was withdrawn and only one member of the class, a Caledonian 812 number E28, is preserved and is currently seen at a heritage railway located within Scotland. As for Scottish trains of Sodor, they were built in 1909 as the last two members of the Caledonian Railway's 652 classes, and they were based in the service across the Scottish region of the Caledonian Railway and even into the LMS era, in which they would travel through outside of Scotland as far as London, where they would even end up at different rail yards on long-distance goods trains that no other engine that was built by the Caledonian or any other company could go, which is a record to be seen by the twins. Even into the British Railways era, they would still travel throughout longer distances, but by 1959, they were already beginning to be worn out, and by the time that the 652s began to be withdrawn, they made their escape towards the island of Sodor, which is seen as a safe haven to the both of them. After finally arriving at their safe haven via their tactics on how to escape from scrap, they would be numbered 9 and 10, and after a few mishaps and a deputation, they were able to stay on the island as they proved to be in tip-top condition even when they're worn out. Around 1961, they were given a special Caledonian blue Northwestern-inspired livery, where they would continue to operate goods traffic along the entirety of the island's operations, even as far as to operating passenger trains from time to time. For a brief period in the 1970s, both Donald and Douglas, as they are named now, were painted in the Caledonian Railways' blue livery, and for some time in the 1980s in British Railways' black, but they returned to their Northwestern Caledonian hybrid-styled livery later on in their lives, while operating on the island of Sodor. From their arrival from the island, they were first allocated at Titmouth, before later moving towards Allsborough in 1967 when the line was extended towards Hardwick, removing the broad gauge system that came before it. Despite their new home now being on the island of Sodor, the Caledonian twins can still operate across the mainland as they would be seen on special rail tours, or you may see them on the island pulling a goods train from the west coast of the island to the easternmost point of the island at Vicarstown, with the Caledonian twins now currently wearing their British Railways' black livery as they continue to operate for the Northwestern Railway ever since. Number 5. The BR Standard Class 02s was a fleet of 262 Prairie-type steam locomotives that were built by Robert E. Riddles at their Darlington and Crewe works, with 30 of these members being built between 1953 and 1957 for operations across the British Railways network. The Standard Class 02s were allocated throughout the London Midland region, while the Darlington-built engines were sent to the southern region to help out with the loads across their each respective systems, and they were not withdrawn until sometime in 1967, where unfortunately none of them has survived in the preservation as of today. BR Standard Class 02T number 84028 was built sometime during 1957, just a month before the completion of the final member of the class, number 84029, at Darlington Works, and was soon allocated to the southern region after being built. The locomotive would operate out of Ashford on push-pull trains across the southern region before ending up on the northeastern region once that line became electrified, and with a brief period of time was reallocated to Eastleigh to work on the Isle of Wight. But by the time that 1966 came around, it was already withdrawn from service. Surprisingly, instead of being scrapped right in there, the workmen at Eastleigh had decided to place the engine in the storage at the back of the sheds, away from anyone to find it, until they can find a likely owner that could buy out the engine and put it up for preservation. Around May of 1966, the engine moved from Eastleigh on a night train secretly towards Barrow-in-Furness, in which a new owner would come up to the rise, and was soon bought out the engine and was soon moved to the island of Sodor. Once on the island, the engine would be allocated towards Vicarstown, where it would operate the Normanby Branch Shuttle Services, a service that would run between Vicarstown, Ballyhoo, Normanby, Crowens Gate, and then back towards Vicarstown once again to repeat the process over and over again. This commuter rail service, operated by the BR Standard, would be seen as a marvelous machine, as the engine could able to pull not only goods traffic, but also passenger traffic from time to time across the seaside village of Norrby. And on a few occasions, would shunt trains across the yards at Norrby, Crowens Gate, and Vickerstown for that said shuttle service, as well as other services that would operate across the Norrby branch, as well as the other engines that also operate across the Norrby branch line. And as of today, the BR Standard Class 02 is still operating across the Norrby branch line, as the tank engine himself would shunt trains across the yards and even pull trains from time to time, but its most famous service being the shuttle service between Vickerstown, Norrby, Crowens Gate, and then back again, being a prized possession of the BR Standard engine. Even if a new build of the BR Standard Class 02 Ts is currently under construction, the Southern-owned BR Standard Class 02 is currently in operation with us to this day. Number 6. The Emerald Stirling Single herself is based on the Great Northern Railway's Stirling Single class, a fleet of 422 steam locomotives that were built by the Great Northern Railway for express passenger trains across the East Coast Main Line between London and York. And they weren't withdrawn until 1916, with only one member of the class surviving in the preservation as of today. Great Northern Stirling Single number 20 was built in 1873 for express passenger trains between London and York on the Great Northern Railway, and she would also attend the 50th anniversary of the opening of the Stockton and Darlington Railway. Her most well-known work was pulling the Flying Scotsman passenger train, an express passenger train which ran from London to Edinburgh via the Northeastern and North British Railway companies, and she would continue to work for the Great Northern Railway under her withdrawal sometime in the early 1900s. After her withdrawal, she was assigned to be a private engine for the directors of the Great Northern, where she would travel across the Great Northern system, even into the days of the LMER, where she was placed alongside number 1 up for preservation. In 1939, she was finally withdrawn from service, where she was placed in the storage for many years after that, until around late 1964, when a private owner had bought her and restored her into operating condition at a time that 1971 came around. For a brief period of time, she had attended many rail events, such as Rail 150 in 1975 and Rocket 150 in 1980 alongside Stirling Single number 1. But her private lease had unfortunately been expired, and in the early 2000s, she was sold off to the island of Sodor, where she would be painted in a special emerald-like livery and was given the name Emily Hutchinson's. While Stirling Single number 1 is now a part of the National Collection, it is on display at York at the National Railway Museum, Emily would be an essential part within the Northwestern Railways family, as she would be seen pulling rail tours just like she did once under private hands, and she would be seen with her own coaches as well as a Great Northern designed carriages that she used to pull when she used to pull the Flying Scotsman service between London and York. She would also venture out outside of Sodor, mainly on rail tours across the mainland and visiting heritage railways across the British Isles. And most of the time, she would also help out with other services and doing odd jobs across the island. And she also is a well-respected departmental engine, as she was renumbered into 2012 around 2021. And as of today, Emily Hutchinson's is still in operation with us with the Northwestern Railway, operating rail tours across the British Isles, as well as doing odd jobs and departmental use from time to time. And despite her old age and even outdated design, she's still well respected by everyone across the island of Sodor, and she's still operating with us to this very day. Number 7. Rail 150 was an event that takes place on the old Stockton and Darlington Railways main line between Stockton and Darlington. The main event for Rail 50 is actually the Shildon Cavalcade, an event in which can take place on the 31st of August, 1975, where all the steam engines that have been preserved throughout the years will travel across the old Stockton and Darlington main line as the event would go on. It was a celebration for the modern-day British railway system, as all of the engines, both old and new, would travel across the Stockton and Darlington main line, as they would celebrate their history by showing off what came before it and what will become on the modern-day British railway system. just after 1975. The event was so massive that even a few guest appearances, as well as other engines, would come in to take place within the cavalcade, as many different engines from the heritage railway scene, as well as mainline operating road tours, would come across and travel across the old Stockton and Darlington route on a cavalcade, which also includes the 3 railway engines of Sodor and the cheeky blue little tank engine himself, appearing at the event as a special guest for the cavalcade. Once the 4 engines of Sodor would arrive at Shildon for the cavalcade, they would travel alongside a London, Midland, and Scottish Railway Black 5, as well as a certain 222 LNWR type steam locomotive that would have been a part of the North Western Railway later on. Many Southern residents would later go to Shildon to see the event where the 4 famous engines as well as these 222 steam locomotive from the LNWR would attend, as well as the other engines that were also attending at this cavalcade event. Most of these engines would return for Rocket 180, which would take place on the old Liverpool and Manchester main line at around 1980, while the 4 famous engines would also return for that event as well. The 4 engines would soon return to Sodor and would continue to operate with the North Western Railway, while the event at Shildon would end off just around the 1st of September. Before 5 years later, Rocket 180 would happen, and the engines would return to attend this cavalcade event, as well as the 4 famous engines of Sodor that would also be there as guest appearances for that event. And with these events now officially being concluded, all of the engines that were involved in the event, such as mainline operated engines, British Railway built diesels, and even engines that were a part of a heritage railway, as well as museum-owned engines, would soon return to their old homes. As both of these events would now be concluded, as most but all of the rolling stock that would attend these events would either be scrapped by British Railways themselves or would continue to operate across the rail tour system until the modern day, as well as displayed for all to see at museums, as well as operating on a heritage railway. And as of today, Rail 150 and Rocket 150 would be remembered by all that would attend this wonderful event of British Railway history. Number 8. The British Pullman Company has operated luxurious first-class passenger trains across Great Britain. These luxurious services would last from the 1870s all the way up towards 1972, when the last of these Pullman services would be withdrawn from service. And ever since 1982, rail tours have been conducted on the British Pullman services as they once operated across Great Britain. The Island of Sodor has operated these Pullman services ever since 1889 with the Hardwick Pullman, and has dabbled into the blue Pullman sets from the 1960s that British Railways was operating back then. But it also became a part of the British Isles that didn't operate only 1, but 2 DMU train sets that are part of the Pullman series. This DMU was experimentally built as a one-off design by Metro Cranwell, and was soon sold to the North Western Railway to operate the Barrow Pullman, a service which ran from Timoth to Vickerstown to supplement the steam hauled services that had been operating in the 1930s. This DMU was unfortunately withdrawn in the 1970s, but is now preserved, but its components have been removed, and what's left of the motor coaches is now converted into a brake coach. As for the Barrow Pullman, it would remain a steam-hauled service even into the 1940s, but by the time that the 1960s came around, it had been clear that the operations for the Barrow Pullman needed an upgrade. And so, in 1961, the last of the steam-hauled Barrow Pullman service would run between Timoth and Vickerstown, and the service the next day would be replaced by a fleet of blue Pullman diesel multiple unit train sets from British Railways. These new train sets would receive very well, as the Northwestern region had supplied maintenance firms at Crovan's Gate to keep these blue Pullman train sets in the service. And by the time that 1965 came around, all of the steam-hauled Pullman services were replaced by these diesel multiple unit served blue Pullman train sets on the island of Sodor. Despite its popularity with many of the residents living on the island of Sodor, they were severely underpowered and not economically valuable to even operate across the British railway system, as they're not entirely successful in their own designs. But nevertheless, the island of Sodor still kept then and maintained and in good condition to operate the 8-car express service. Unfortunately, this wasn't to last, as in the early 1970s, British Railways began to be withdrawing their own Blue Pullman train sets, and by 1973, the last of the Southern Blue Pullman sets were pulled out of service and replaced in storage. Eventually, a few of the Blue Pullman sets from Sodor would be restored to operating condition as they would operate rail tours across the island. And by the time that the 1990s came around, they were given an overhaul and were soon painted in the Northwestern Railway Gala Blue livery with white lining and was soon given the crescently named the Barrow Bell. The Barrow Bell became the first ever named passenger train to ever operate by the Rail Tour Company of the Northwestern Railway, which was privatized from British Railways in 1997, and as of today, the Barrow Bell continues to operate with new and maintained units from the 1960s still going on across the Northwestern Railway system. And it is projected that their next overhaul wouldn't come until the 2030s. But we could still see them in operation with us to this very day, until that overhaul happens. That is. Number 9. The Bear Peacock Metropolitan patterned steam locomotives was a fleet of 440 tank engine designs built by Bear Peacock between 1864 and 1885 and were separated into 2 different classes, the A classes and the B classes, which were all built by Bear Peacock and Company for use on the Metropolitan Railway as well as other railways across Great Britain as well as abroad. Most of these designs that were patented by Bear Peacock were all withdrawn from service, with only 2 of the exported models being preserved in Spain, while the Metropolitan's A-Class is survived under L45, an engine which was withdrawn in 1948, which is now on display at the London Transport Museum. The island of Sodor would order a fleet of these Bear Peacock patented engines for the Sodor and Mainland Railway, with the first 20 being built as 44T steam locomotives, but later on, 10 of these designs would be rebuilt into 442 Atlantics, and they were used on suburban operations outside of Bakerstown and Kirk Ronan towards Crovan's Gate and Kildane, where these 440s and 442 Atlantics would operate until being acquired by the Northwestern Railway in 1914. Later, they would be scattered across the island and were used on departmental duties and other services across the island until the British Railways era, where in 1948 withdrawals had begun, and by the time that the last of them had been withdrawn, which was on December, most of the designs would be scrapped. Fortunately, one 440T and one 442 Atlantic from the Sodor and Mainland Railway are preserved, and both of them were restored into operations in 1952, and they would commence on rail tours across the Normanby branch line, as well as departmental use for the British Railways network, but they were mostly remained on rail tours across the island, and or being on display for special events. As of today, the 2 engines are now currently on site display at 2 different museums, the Tiffin Transport Museum and the National Royal Museum of Sodor, otherwise known as the Bakerstown Royal Museum, where they would likely to stay on site display for the rest of their lives, and keeping the legacy of the Bear Peacock's patented engines alive alongside the other 3 preserved Bear Peacock steam locomotives that were built to their designs. And finally, number 10. Bloomer is based on the LNWR Bloomer class of steam locomotives, a fleet of 222 express steam locomotives that were built by the LNWR for express passenger service across the LNWR. He would be used by the LNWR for its southern division, pulling express trains out of London's Euston towards destinations like Holyhead, Crewe, Liverpool, and even Manchester, before his inevitable withdrawal sometime during the 1870s and 1880s. After his withdrawal from the London and Northwestern Railway, he was soon sold to the Portpatrick and Wigtownshire Joint Railway in Scotland, where he would operate the service until sometime during the 1900s, Ray was withdrawn from service and he was placed in the storage. And he was soon presumed scrapped alongside the rest of his brothers and sisters. But this was debunked around the 1970s when a fat controller stumbled upon an old shed in Wigtownshire and he was soon found. After this, he was sent to the Grown Skate Works for his overhaul, in which was completed in time for his attendance in the Shield and Cavalcade in 1975, which is to celebrate the 150 years of the Stockton and Darlington Railway. After this, now being painted in his fictitious red livery, Bloomer would soon pull special trains alongside two observation cars that the Fat Controller had found, which were based on the LNWR observation coaches, in where he would make occasional public appearances on the Fireporter branch line, where he would be seen pulling special trains across the Fireporter branch line, and he would also attend another event, which was Rocket 180 in 1980, to participate in the cavalcade alongside another LNWR-built steam locomotive. And as of today, Bloomer is still with us in the Northwestern Railway, alongside a now cancelled under construction replica of an LNWR Bloomer class, alongside a replica version of Wolverton. As of now, Bloomer has recently re-entered into service after his overhaul, pulling special trains again along the Fireporter branch line, and he will continue to do so to this very day. And that basically wraps up this video, I guess. So yeah, that's basically everything for my 14th entry of this little series that, yeah, you get the idea. So yeah, it's honestly been surprising on how much things have changed since 1825. And now I'm really thinking about it. It's almost nearly a year before the United States turns 250. And I honestly feel that I need to celebrate that with a special video. But, you know, I'm getting ahead of myself. There are some things that I admire, you know, my other interests, as I wanted to talk about on this channel, as well as my other, but surprisingly active, secondary channel that, for some reason, that I created. I just wanted some diversity within this channel, since talking about the same thing like over and over and over and over again, which would be too tiring and would just basically make my channel feel more blander than it could really get. As well as experimenting some things on this channel for you guys to see and watch, and whatever that I made for these two channels. So yeah. Also, the next one will be in November, yeah, you get the idea. So yeah, I'll probably see you guys like in November or something, I don't know. Bye-bye, I guess.